So I'd like to welcome everyone again to today's webinar. So before I begin, I want to respect and honour Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander elders past, present and future. We acknowledge the stories, traditions and living cultures of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples on this land and commit to building a brighter future together. So we're here today to learn about Charles Bonnet Syndrome. So the title of the presentation today is Visions with Low Vision, a whirlwind tour through the unusual world of Charles Bonnet Syndrome. So my name is Natasha and I will be the host today. And we'll be here with our presenter, Scot Muirden, who is from Charles Bonnet Syndrome Foundation. So I'll ask Scott to come on the screen while I read out his bio. So Scott has 2 degrees in psychology and social work, both from the University of Melbourne. After working for nearly a decade in the mental health sector, he decided on a new direction. Coming from a family of vision impairment, his mother and brother have congenital conditions. He chose to enter the eye healthcare domain in 2004. While working at the Royal Victorian Eye and Ear Hospital, Scott came across numerous cases of Charles Bonnet Syndrome, a condition he was then unfamiliar with. Scott soon became intrigued by this syndrome, but noted that coverage of the condition within the eye healthcare sector was lacking. In 2012, Scott founded the first ever organisation dedicated to Charles Bonnet Syndrome in the world. So I'll get you to turn your webcam on. Thanks for joining us. I'll hand over to you, Scott.
Thank you very much, Natasha, for the introduction. Yes, I'm just like what Natasha said, I'd like to acknowledge the land on which I'm presenting from, which is the Wurundjeri land, also known as Woiwurrung. To begin with, I wish to acknowledge that tomorrow is the International Day of People with Disability. And I think it's important to state that disability does not define a person. And hopefully one day we will have gone beyond the need to separate the world in terms of able-bodied and disabled-bodied people. But for now, I think it's a worthwhile acknowledgement of diversity and difference, and that everyone has their place. So, thanks for the opportunity to speak with you today. This is going to be a whirlwind tour, so unfortunately I'm not going to be able to cover every aspect of the syndrome. I'll do my best, but as Natasha outlined from the beginning, if you feel that the particular issue that's important to you has not been touched upon or has not been answered during this presentation, please ask your questions in the question box and we will definitely respond. If it can't happen within the actual presentation, post-presentation, the answers will be referred on to you. So what we're doing today is we're talking about dedicating time to what I consider to be a taboo subject. It's a subject that precious few wanted to discuss, even though it's probably one of the most common eye health conditions that almost no one's ever heard of. Excuse me. And in the field of eye health care, this issue remains the elephant in the room. And so what we'll be doing in this short period of time today is to actually shine a light on this fascinating syndrome that we desperately need to start bringing out into the open. We need to start talking about it because at the moment, there's a lot of mystery surrounding it. There's a lot of misunderstandings. There's silence and suffering that currently plagues thousands upon thousands of vision impaired people, not only here in Australia, but across the globe. So let's then begin the journey. Now I'm hoping that, yes. Okay. So, sorry, I'm having a bit of technical problems. No, I'm okay now. So let's begin where it really begins for, say, the Macular Disease Foundation, as well as the Charles Bonnet Syndrome Foundation. The real cornerstone is vision loss. And what we know is that vision loss is not a singular loss. Now, there may well be one form of vision loss, such as macular disease, but there's often ripple effects on many other aspects of the person's life. So vision loss is actually multiple losses. There's the loss of a job, the loss of being able to drive, the loss of reading ability, the loss of seeing your grandchildren's faces, the loss of confidence in being able to safely and confidently move around your world, both indoors and outdoors, the loss of a sense of independence. The list goes on and on. But combined, they can be very taxing on the person's emotional and mental state. Now, what about if on top of all this loss that we've just quickly outlined, we actually add something to the mix? And this addition is an entirely unexpected and sometimes scary addition to the person's life. So the person who is having to deal with vision loss now finds themselves dealing with vision gains that can be very concerning. And the initial question is, why are they there, these visual gains, and what does it mean for me? So what we'll come to understand in this short presentation is that many things about this syndrome don't make any sense. Just consider the title of this webinar, Visions with Low Vision. That's a bizarre concept to get your head around. You have low vision, you may even be deemed legally blind, and yet you're having visions, often very clear and detailed ones. How on earth can that be? It simply doesn't make sense. It seems like a contradiction. So, welcome to the world of Charles Bonnet Syndrome. So let's begin then. Let's begin where it all began, which is back in 1759 in Geneva, in what is now known as part of Switzerland. Now, in that year, there was an elderly gentleman. He was 89, and his name was Mr. Lulin. And he was a retired magistrate, very well known throughout the whole district. He was known for his sharp intellect, and he was held in high regard, even at 89. But he had failing vision, and he'd had a cataract removed 1753, and then he'd had the other one removed in 1758. And this Mr. Lulin started to have some unusual visual experiences. And it just so happened that his grandson was over one day, and the grandson was already in his 30s, was already a very famous natural scientist and was held in great regard throughout Europe. And he mentioned to the grandson that about some unusual things he was seeing. For example, he said that sometimes strange objects would float mid-air above him. He had a recurring image of seeing a a blue handkerchief with yellow circles in each of the four corners of the handkerchief. Now, he would see that over and over again every day in different situations. And what he found was that he saw a whole range of other things. He saw a rotating wheel hovering midair. Sometimes he would go out into the township and he would see some real scaffolding, some real work going on. And then he would come home and he'd be in his living room and he would see exactly the same scaffolding he'd seen in the city square, but now it was in a miniature form at only about a foot high in his living room. He had the opposite experience of seeing a carriage from his upstairs window on the first floor. He saw a horse and carriage arrive on the other side of the street. And lo and behold, he watched as this carriage grew and grew till it got so big that it was more than 30 foot tall. Still very clearly a carriage, but its proportions were enormous. So it just so happened that his grandson was in the process then of writing a book on psychology. And the grandson, hearing all these experiences of Mr. Llewellyn, his grandfather, thought, wow, I'm going to include this in my book. So the following year, a book was published by the grandson, and in it, there were under the section of sight, he mentioned these unusual experiences. Now, I'm about to show you one quote from that book in 1760. It's a lot of text. I'm sorry about that. It's the only one with this much text in the presentation. I will read it out for those who would struggle to read it. But what needs to be stated is that this grandson is none other than the man himself, Charles Bonnet. So this is part of what Charles Bonnet, the natural scientist, wrote. I know of a wise gentleman of great reputation and good health, very good memory, who now and again, while fully awake and without any external impression, sees images of men and women, birds, coaches, buildings. The images change size, and they appear and disappear. And the buildings all appear in detail before his eyes. And the images were perfect, would appear in the outside world as if present. The images were always silent. This man never accepted these images as real and took them for what they were. Now, this really sums up Charles Bonnet Syndrome, because it's really outlining what became so important and why Bonnet himself thought it was important to note, because he felt he'd come across the first ever case of people seeing things that aren't really there, and yet their mind remains unaffected. They still have a healthy brain and mind and thought. And so he thought that this was curious because this was something quite new. So what I'll do now very quickly is give just a few depictions of the sort of experiences we're talking about that Mr. Llewellyn went through back in the 18th century. So I've picked this first one. What you can see on the screen now is of a cat, and the cat has turned its face to face the viewer. But you'll notice that there's a big black blob in the center part, and that is to depict someone who's got macular problems, and so that ability for their central vision has been affected. So you can only see just over half the cat's face. The rest is blocked out. And then overlaid of the image of the cat and the macular spot is brickwork, what essentially looks like brickwork. And so this is an experience that is quite commonly experienced with Bonnet syndrome, where they will experience some type of regular pattern that appears overlaid over whatever it is they're seeing. In this case, a cat. Now, very similar with this second slide, we've got, you're looking at a woman, a middle-aged woman, and you can't, again, because of macular disease, you can't make out the details of this woman's face. You'll also notice that a lot of the colour is leached out of the whole picture, which is trying to reflect what a lot of people with macular degeneration experience. Not only do they lose the ability to make out fine detail, like seeing people's faces, but that often colour seems to be not as rich as it once was. And yet, on the woman's right shoulder, there's a very large butterfly that one can see in very good detail, and it's very rich in colour. So this is yet another example of the syndrome, and we move on to the final one. And here we have a bathroom scene. Again, not much colour or richness of colour in the perception. You'll see that there's lots of black blobs throughout the view of the bathroom as a result of a vision impairment. But there in the basin, the wash basin of the bathroom, there's a very unusual looking character with golden skin, and he's wearing a most unusual headdress. And for some, that can be extremely terrifying to have an image like that, to see something so striking as that. So if you can imagine going through those types of experiences, you might start to ask yourself the question that appears now on the screen, which is, what on earth is happening to me? And the problem is that as it stands at the moment with this syndrome and its place in the world, because it's not very well known, not only in popular culture, it's not discussed in the media, but even more, as we'll touch on later, even within the medical and healthcare sectors, the awareness of the syndrome seems to be quite low. And a lot of you out there might be able to relate to that fact, that often you may be surprised that when you talk to your GP or your ophthalmologist or clinical care team at an aged care facility, that they'll say, Charles, what? And they won't know about it. So often then, when people start to have these unusual experiences, there's no forewarning. They don't know, no one's mentioned anything about this syndrome. No one's ever asked, are you experiencing these symptoms? And no one's, so it all comes suddenly to the person, and you need to make sense of it somehow. And so if you don't have any, if you haven't been advised about the syndrome, then these sorts of questions run through your mind. You wonder, is this the start of dementia? Was there something wrong with my brain itself? Is there maybe a tumour? Do I have a mental illness? Am I going to end up in institutional care? Am I going to lose my independence? And will I be shamed or ridiculed if I open up to others? And we'll find that actually, as will be discussed a bit later, the last one is very common with Charles Bonnet syndrome. A lot of people are very reluctant to open up and share what they're going through. And why? Well, because in a nutshell, for a lot of people with Bonnet syndrome, they ask, when it starts happening, like with those slides we just saw, the fundamental thing they'll ask themselves is, first I lost my vision, am I now losing my mind? Now this is a page taken from a graphic novel from England, from Gareth Brooks, an author, and his main character, Miriam, who's you can see on the screen now, she is vision impaired. I think from memory she has macular degeneration, and she's starting to experience these symptoms again with no forewarning, and she is wondering what on earth is going on. And so it's beautifully depicted by the fact that this very heavy black crayon is totally enveloping her. And that really, I think, in a lot of ways sums up on various levels, literal and metaphoric, about the fears that Miriam is having. So then what is this syndrome? Well, probably the easiest way to put it is that it's the experience of phantom images that keep returning over a period of time, and they happen almost exclusively in people who have some form of vision impairment, but their mind is not affected. So Charles Bonnet syndrome is not associated with dementia or some psychiatric condition. It's not associated with memory decline. You will notice one thing that needs to be said is that these images that people see, as was mentioned earlier with Charles Bonnet himself, is that the images are silent. So that means that these images that you see are only in the visual realm. So, for example, if we focus on that strange-looking character in the sink in the bathroom, it's not unusual with Bonnet syndrome to see an unusual character like that in the sink, but it's very unusual and not typical for Charles Bonnet syndrome if that figure talks to you, or if the figure reaches out and you feel it on a tactile level. You can feel the figure, or you can smell the figure. So if any of these other senses are involved, then that may be a sign you're dealing with something other than Charles Bonnet syndrome, because what is distinctive about Charles Bonnet syndrome is that the images are silent. And a lot of people talk about being like, it's like watching a silent movie. Now, the other thing that I should mention here is that you'll notice that we've said phantom images. Now, we have used the word phantom images for two reasons. One is that even though the more common word is visual hallucinations, strictly speaking, medically speaking, it is understood that what people are experiencing with Charles Bonnet syndrome is not a true hallucination. A true hallucination is when a person sees something that's not there, but they believe that they're real. They believe that what they're seeing is real, and they incorporate it into their reality. Now, what makes Charles Bonnet syndrome different, as was said in that text from the 18th century from Charles Bonnet, was that he understood that they were not real. So the actual real word in medical terms for what people are experiencing in Charles Bonnet is a pseudo hallucination, or what's known as a false hallucination. Now, even though that's the correct word, we don't like to use that word because whether you're saying visual hallucination or pseudo hallucination, they both are using a word that is very, it's a loaded word. When we hear the word heroin, it's loaded. It comes with a lot of meanings attached to it. The same with hallucination. It comes with a lot of meanings. And invariably, hallucination is associated with mental illness. So that is why we prefer to use less stigmatizing language, and we want to use a word that's friendlier or more neutral. So we use phantom images, but there's other words that you could use. You could say Bonnet images, and hopefully one day it will become known as Bonnet images. And then if you look at Charles Bonnet himself, what he wrote back in 1760 was the word visions. Now, for some people, visions has it's associated with religious connotations, so not everyone feels comfortable with that. But anyway, these are just some alternative terms to consider. So what we're having here with Charles Bonnet syndrome is a very unusual experience of two visual worlds that are coming together at the same time. So on the one hand, you have the vision impaired person has their regular experience of the outside world based on their vision impairment. So there might be areas of their visual fields that are blurred, some parts they can't see at all. They may have to draw on their side vision to really make out anything. So you've got that, your everyday vision impaired visual experience. And then on top of that, you have these phantom images that are, if you like, superimposed over your everyday visual experience. Now, sometimes these images that appear and are superimposed, they can fit in very nicely to your everyday environment so that you almost don't notice it's there. So for example, you might be going to your kitchen table and there's a fruit bowl there. You haven't stocked up on fruit and the fruit bowl's actually empty, but as a result of Bonnet syndrome, the bowl is full of fruit. Or there a vase that you don't really have, there's a vase that appears on a bench. That's where image can blend in very nicely with your everyday life experience. But then you get some very unusual ones, some of which we've referred to earlier. So what type of images are we talking about? What sort of things are people seeing with Charles Bonnet syndrome? Well, there's too many to mention here, but let's just break it down to two components. There's what's considered to be more basic or elementary forms. Now that includes things like seeing dots, colored blobs, lines, horizontal, vertical lines, and then a bit like with the cat example given earlier of geometric patterns. It can be of, say, tiles or lattice or grids and checkerboards, chess sets, things like this. And then you have the more complex forms. And that will include things like objects, household objects, buildings, vehicles, faces, figures, and even full landscapes. So the big question then is, why does CBS occur? Well, the truth is no one actually knows. Now, Bonnet himself, he suggested back in 1760 that he believed that there was an organ of sight within the brain and that was responsible. Now, back then in scientific thinking, it wasn't even known that there was a specific area of the brain devoted to vision. So he was well ahead of his time, and he's still accurate today because it is linked to the visual region of the brain. But we mainly think, the current thinking is that it's all about the drop in visual input. So if you think about your vision, especially if you've acquired vision loss in later life, then you've enjoyed having a regular stream of visual information coming through the eyes, and then the information going to the brain, the visual part of the brain, all your life. And then suddenly, because of macular problems, for example, then the amount of information that is coming through this river can start to dry up. And the brain starts to get a bit restless, as we'll see in a moment. So what I've got on the screen now is a side image, a portrait image of a female head. So if you think of like all the Australian coins, and on the head side you see the side portraiture of the Queen Elizabeth II. This isn't Queen Elizabeth II, but what you're seeing is a side view of a woman's head, and you'll notice that you'll see that it's filled, the main image is of the brain, and then there's one area at the back of the head which is in a different color, and that represents the visual region of the brain. And so that's at the back of the head, just above the nape of the neck. That's where the visual region is. Now you'll see there that in front of the woman's head, just maybe a foot in front of her eyes, is a rose. Now normally what happens with vision is that the light impulses come from the rose, they hit the eye, as I'm showing now, the arrows, and then they head all the way to the visual region at the back to let you know that you're seeing a rose. Now, what happens with people who experience vision loss and develop Charles Bonnet Syndrome? Now, I've tried to describe it here like sort of fireworks, that's sort of those rays that are radiating from. What we're saying is that because the amount of visual information that is coming from the rose or whatever is reduced, then the brain starts to get a bit restless. And it says, where's all the information? I'm used to getting lots and lots of information, it's dried up. And so what we notice, it's been shown in brain imaging scans, that what is happening is that the brain starts to become overactive and it's firing furiously. The brain cells there are firing spontaneously, and it's believed that that is what's generating the images. So what actually happens is that in the case of the flower now with CBS, that the image is generated, it goes in the opposite direction. The image is generated by the firing cells in the visual region of the brain, and it appears outside, beyond your eyes, in this case of a rose. The other way that we can explain why CBS is occurring is that the example I've given is also very similar to another condition known as phantom limb. Now, you may not have heard of the term phantom limb, but when I explain it, probably all of you have heard of it. It's the experience that's been known of for 500 years, whereby if someone happens to lose a limb, say an arm or a leg, through battle, through injury, or through forced amputation, that a staggering 90% of people will go on to experience sensations as if that limb is still there, and that can continue for months, even years after that limb has been lost. So really what Charles Bonnet Syndrome is, it's phantom vision, and it operates in a very similar way. So how common is this condition? Well, again, no one actually knows, and the reason is because no one's really done any full comprehensive studies to be able to explain, to be able to determine that. But we do know that for a long time, and even still today, that a lot of people will refer to the condition as rare. And this was summed up very well by one ophthalmologist I met. And he made the following comment once when asked how often he comes across CBS amongst his patients. And he said, well, I've been in the field over 25 years and I could count on one hand the number of people who have raised CBS with me. It's incredibly rare. Well, so on the one hand, yes, he's right. Only 5 people have come forward and told him of their experiences. So 1 in 5 years, that does sound rare. The problem is, though, that ophthalmologist did finally admit that he never raised the topic with any of his patients, that he was relying on the patient themselves to share their story. Now, in fact, there was a famous study done in 2005, and in that study, they found the highest ever prevalence rate of CBS of 63%. Now, what I wanted to draw your attention to is that even in that situation with a very high level of people who had CBS, the study noted that none volunteered their symptoms, not one person. And so this shows how well hidden the condition is. And in fact, we know through many, many studies over many years that actually the foundation is suggesting that about 40% of all those who acquire vision loss will develop this syndrome. So 4 out of 10 people. And we also know that in advanced cases of macular degeneration, that the figure is believed to jump to 60%. So why then is the syndrome so well hidden? We've got an ophthalmologist who's saying, I hardly come across the syndrome. Doctors say, Charles, what? A lot of people who've never heard of the syndrome, no one's talking about it. So, but now the foundation is saying 40% of people and 60% for those in advanced cases. So that doesn't go together. That's yet another contradiction. It doesn't make sense. So let me quickly try and outline why this problem exists. There's 2 forces at play that have been going on for a very long time, and it's accidental, but these 2 forces are sort of dovetailing to ensure that the condition remains hidden. The first is the issue for the client or the person who's living with the syndrome. So there's been studies that have shown that up to 75% of all people who develop the syndrome never mention their experiences to anyone, not even their nearest and dearest. They're terrified to do so. So they are very reluctant to open up. And as I've just put on the screen now, it's because often they've got no idea what's happening because no one's ever mentioned it to them before. So remember the original fears that they've got, that am I going to lose my independence? Am I going to end up in a institutional care? Am I going to be sent to psychiatry and put on powerful drugs? So they're not going to, the person doesn't really want to share their experiences. So here's just a Danish medical journal from 6 years ago saying low awareness of the syndrome amongst their patients going to the retinal clinic. And here from that study, it says they found that only 12% of their patients knew about CBS. And then we've got the medical invisibility that we've already just touched upon. So a lot are not familiar with it. And often they make a misdiagnosis, and then they're taken down a path of medical treatment that is actually not appropriate. CBS is often not part of their training, and importantly, they're not really following, the ophthalmologists are not following their own clinical guidelines from RANZCO, which stands for Royal Australian and New Zealand College of Ophthalmologists, who say at one point that ophthalmologists need to be aware of and openly discuss the possibility of CBS with people who have lost vision. Now, we know that that's generally not happening at the moment. And then, of course, very few just generalist books on macular degeneration that you can find in your bookshop. Probably about 3/4 of them don't mention CBS at all. So here we've got a study that was done just from 2 years ago in Canada, looking at how many GPs were familiar with the syndrome, and they found 55% had never heard of the syndrome. And then a further 20% said they were slightly aware. So that means 75% of all GPs in Canada had a great lack of knowledge about CBS. And here it goes without saying that they found that the GPs never discussed the syndrome as a possibility with patients who've experienced vision loss. This is just the ICD-11, which is like the the global book of health conditions from the World Health Organization. Charles Bonnet Syndrome was recognized in its own right last year. This is the part where it's mentioned. So it's got its own category, and that's going to help with identification. Sorry, I went forward a few there. Here's that RANZCO, the College of Ophthalmologists. You'll see here very quickly that it's very clearly telling ophthalmologists that they need to be raising the topic, but unfortunately on the ground, it's not happening. So this is sort of the bit where I wind it up, but importantly, we need to focus quickly on, is there any treatment for CBS? Now, I don't have time in this short presentation to go through everything. I would recommend that you look on our website under the category treatments, and you'll be able to see everything there. But one of the big things that we hear is there's nothing that can be done. We get a lot of people who contact the foundation and say, well, I know there's nothing that can be done, but, and this is a word that's often being used by ophthalmologists who are telling their patients, yeah, you've got CBS, but there's nothing that can be done. Now, this is misleading. There is actually things that can be done. There's obviously individual variation in who responds to what interventions you explore, but there's definitely no doubt that there are a range of interventions that one can explore that can and do sometimes make quite a difference to reducing the frequency and severity of the symptoms and sometimes resolving it entirely. So let's very quickly go through a few of these. The first is maximize your remaining vision. Now there's two levels to this. The first is surgical. So is there, according to your eye specialist, is there any type of surgical procedure you can have done that is going to improve your vision? And if so, then that often can mean that not only improve vision, but the CBS can resolve. And there are cases of that happening, especially when it comes to cataract surgery. There are quite a few cases where once the cataract's removed, the person enjoys better vision and the CBS seems to be resolved. Now, I know that for a lot of people, they've been told that there's nothing that can be done for their macular disease problem. But then we get on to the second level, and that is about accessing low vision services. through like the Macular Disease Foundation, through Vision Australia, through Guide Dogs, these types of organisations. This is about you making the most of the remaining vision you have. It covers a lot of areas. So if you're experiencing glare, explore anti-glare glasses. Get a low vision specialist to come and assess your lighting, your home lighting. Is your lighting optimal for your particular eye condition? Make sure you use all the visual aids that are available. Do everything and anything that is going to bring out the best in the remaining vision you have left. One of the problems is people have start to get a habitual way of responding to the visions, either annoyance, frustration, or fear. And sometimes people can get locked into that experience. So what we encourage is for people to start to view the images in a fresh way. And that certainly can help. Now, one of the most common situations where people will experience Charles Bonnet Syndrome is when they're at home, often alone, and often when they are not involved in any particular activity, and in a period that we quickly refer to as quiet wakefulness. That's often when it happens. So what we encourage is that we think that the quiet wakefulness is playing with the Bonnet syndrome because the brain is desperate for stimulation. And if the brain's not occupied with some task, even if it's just washing the dishes or making a sandwich, things like that, it's when people are just quietly wakeful that the brain starts to often move in and say, okay, you're not providing me much stimulation, so I'm going to move in and produce some images for you. So try to engage more with life. Try to flip things around so that you're more actively engaged. Finally, there's medication that can be explored. There are definitely cases where people are given medication and it works and their Bonnet syndrome resolves within days. However, a cautionary note, this only works about 30% of the time. Now, for the other 70% of the time, it either has no effect, doesn't work, or it can lead to unwanted side effects. So if you're going to explore the example of medication, then please discuss it with your doctor and please be told about the possible pros and cons of that approach. What could be the possible downsides of taking the medication so you can make an informed decision. So I think I'll end it here and pass it back to Natasha, and maybe we can explore your questions.
Thanks so much, Scott. I'll just bring up my slides. That's great. Now, before we go to questions, just a reminder how to ask the questions to Scott and myself. So it's by using that questions icon on the right-hand side of your webinar panel, typing them out in the white box, and of course, hitting send to send them through to us. So I do just want to quickly talk about some of the work Macular Disease Foundation has been involved in. So we actually started with the goal to reduce the impact and incidence of macular disease. And we do this through 4 main pillars of work. So the first one is prevention and early detection. So we do this through, of course, our education sessions as well as our big awareness campaigns. And we hope to prevent people getting to the later stage of macular disease, which can result in irreversible vision loss or conditions like Charles Bonnet Syndrome. Talking to people about tools such as the AMSA grid for early detection, as well as regular monitoring and following a healthy diet and lifestyle. We also have support and services, and this is mainly through our toll-free helpline number, as well as through the free information books we provide and our website. We advocate for the very best of the macular disease community whether this is designing state or federal policies or making sure that Medicare rebates are not cut. And finally, for the past 9 years, we've had a research grants program. So since its inception, we've contributed $4 million to Australian research in the field of macular disease. So the number on the screen is, of course, our toll-free national helpline number, which is how you can access our support and services. We also have an education email on the screen as education@mdfoundation.com.au, and the website, which is www.mdfoundation.com.au. So I am conscious that we are running short on time, but if you would like to stay on the line to go through some of the live questions that are coming through, I'll ask Scott to come back on and get him to help answer them. Thanks, Scott. So the first question here is, why do some people see geometric patterns and others see people's faces, animals, or something else? Are past memories or trauma connected to this?
Wow, that's a huge question, and you could write a PhD on that. Okay, so let's look at the first part. Why do some people see geometric patterns while others see faces or buildings? So the short answer is this, excuse me, that the visual region of the brain, known as the visual cortex, it's been known for some decades now, but there are specialized cells in different regions of the visual cortex that are devoted to different things. So there's an area, the primary visual cortex, which is called V1 or V2, which is the basic area, the basics. And so that is for seeing basic patterns like horizontal and vertical lines, patterns, things like that. And then you've got an area called V4, boring names I know, but that area is renowned for seeing colour. And then we've got an area called the fusiform gyrus, and that area is specifically for seeing faces. So it's very, it's like there's different compartments within the visual region of the brain. One area sees faces, one area sees buildings, one sees basic patterns. So what has been shown is that when people with Charles Bonnet Syndrome have been hooked up to a brain imaging machine, what they have found is if they're seeing the patterns, then they will find that that area V1, V2, the primary visual cortex, that is the area that is spontaneously firing, and that area only. So it's a perfect correlation, which is just like normal vision. So normally if we see a pattern in front of us, we're playing a game of chess, then that region in our brain will also start to light up. So if it's shown that you're getting a lot of activity in the fusiform gyrus, you will see faces. So really, that's the reason. It depends. Now, no one knows why a certain region of the brain is activated and another is not. We don't have that understanding as yet. As to the second part of the question, trauma and past experiences, certainly my feeling is that a lot of people's visions, whatever they are, can often be linked to something that a person saw often in their childhood. So sometimes we can be going 50, 60, 70 years back when the person is able to link the image to something that happened then.
Great, thanks for that. Move on to the next question. So this is another link between Charles Bonnet and some other conditions. So this person's asking, is there any evidence of a connection with dementia or Alzheimer's disease? So you said that in the presentation, there's often the misconception that having the phantom images may be dementia, but do you think there's a link between the two?
when people see things that aren't really there, there's about 25 medical possibilities to explain that. CBS is one, Alzheimer's is another. There's a whole range of possibilities. Even another one is prescribed medications. And in fact, that's quite relevant for that. Maybe I should bring up with the short amount of time left for people with macular degeneration, because, so there are 25 possibilities, but at the moment, as it stands, I do not believe there's any evidence. There's been lots of studies done in recent years that have wondered, is there a link between Charles Bonnet syndrome and that sort of becoming the precursor to dementia or something similar? And really the conclusion at the moment is there's no evidence for that at all. There have been studies done on people with Charles Bonnet syndrome. They've done a follow-up a few years later, and there's been no change in their memory or their thinking at all. But having said that, it is possible to have both. Just like when you're getting on in life, it's possible to have arthritis and macular degeneration. So it is possible, because of vision loss, to get Charles Bonnet syndrome, and then maybe also it's possible to get Alzheimer's. So it's possible for them to coexist. But in terms of a direct link between the two, no, I don't believe there's any evidence at this point in time to suggest that. So just quickly about the other point about the prescribed medications. There's been some studies done on the wet form of macular degeneration in Portugal in the last few years. And one of their findings was that for people who have the wet form, and only the wet form, not the dry form, but the people who are having the injections in the eye to try and stabilize their vision, they need to be aware of two possibilities. One is that there is one of those injections known as Avastin, or also known as bevacizumab, that's its other name. Now, there have been known occasions where that injection has been known to trigger Charles Bonnet syndrome. So people need to be aware of that, and we would be recommending, we think that ophthalmologists, when they're giving the injection, especially if they're giving Avastin, that they need to be warning people that this is a possibility. The second thing from that study in Portugal on just the wet form was that they found that if people, the people who have the wet form, if they're also taking drugs for a medication for stomach ulcers or heartburn, that sort of medication, what are known as proton pump inhibitors, they've found if you have the wet form of macular degeneration and you're taking that regular prescribed medication for your stomach acid problems, you're twice at risk of getting Charles Bonnet syndrome.
Interesting. Okay, thanks for sharing your thoughts. And I think that's helped answer a few other questions coming in about the injections. So hopefully to those people asking them, that did answer it completely. Just one final question, which I might be able to help answer as well. So this person's asking, are there any foods that can help with low vision to preserve vision or slow the progression? So I might speak to that just in relation to macular disease. So macular degeneration in particular, there's been evidence to show that nutrition can be helpful in slowing the progression. So the foods we recommend are typically oily fish like salmon, mackerel and sardines 2 to 3 times a week. Dark leafy green vegetables which contain high concentrations of lutein and zeaxanthin, and trying to get these into our diet every day, as well as a balance of other coloured fruit and vegetables. Other things like a handful of raw unsalted nuts, trying to reduce oily and fatty foods in general are all part of that balanced diet. In terms of other macular diseases, diabetic eye disease, of course, controlling weight is critical with diabetes, and you can be doing this by following a healthy diet as well. Particular foods for people with diabetes, it's probably recommended you go back to your diabetes educator or a dietitian, and they can help find a diet plan that's suitable for you. So I thought I was best to answer that one, Scott, just because it may have been a little out of your realm. And that's all for the questions today.